He stepped outside, heading for the rental car through the quiet parking lot. Suddenly, the bright lights of a police car blinded him, and his heart twitched. The car braked sharply a few feet away, tires squealing on the pavement. "Stay where you are, hands up." At the end of the story, leave your opinion below, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. A warm evening in Nashville, Tennessee, promised to be balmy for Caleb Wilson. He was here for the weekend to give a lecture at a local college. Caleb, a 40-year-old African-American with a short haircut and dark eyes, worked as an equity counselor in law enforcement. He was invited to speak to students about racial profiling issues, and he gladly agreed. After the lecture, Caleb stopped by a small restaurant on the edge of town that served fried chicken and sweet tea. There he was recognized by an elderly couple sitting at a nearby table. They remembered his presentation at a conference last year and struck up a conversation. "You explain so clearly how the system breaks people," the woman said, adjusting her glasses. Caleb smiled and nodded, used to such conversations after his lectures. They talked about how hard it was to change laws when prejudice sat in their heads. The conversation dragged on, and Caleb didn't notice it was getting dark. After saying goodbye to the couple, he walked outside, heading for his rental car through the quiet parking lot. Suddenly, the bright lights of a police car blinded him, and his heart twitched. The car braked sharply a few feet away, tires squealing on the pavement. "Stay where you are, hands up," shouted a voice from the darkness, harsh and demanding. Caleb froze, slowly raising his palms, trying not to make any sudden movements. He knew the rules by heart. He himself had taught others how to behave around the police. Two officers jumped out of the car, both white, both young, with tense faces. One had his hand on his holster, the other was already striding toward him. "What's up, officers?" Caleb asked, trying to speak evenly, though everything clenched inside. "Turn around, hands on the car now," barked the one closer, not answering the question. Caleb obeyed, feeling the cold metal of the hood touch his palms. The third officer, older, stepped out of the car with lazy confidence. His name was Sergeant Paul Harris, a name Caleb read on the badge later. Harris was a large man with graying hair and a look that read contempt. "Let's see what we've got here," he said, nodding to the younger officer, Brandon Cox. Brandon slipped his hand into Caleb's jacket pocket and pulled out a small baggie of white powder. "Wow, we got a find," Harris grinned, crossing his arms over his chest. Caleb felt the blood rush from his face. "It's not mine, you know that," he said, trying to keep his voice firm. He'd seen cases like this dozens of times, planted evidence, false accusations, especially against people of his color. Harris tilted his head, as if scrutinizing him with interest. "That's what you all say, kid," he threw in, and Brandon added, "Looks guilty, Sergeant, to me." Cold handcuffs clicked on Caleb's wrists, and he was shoved into the car. A small crowd had gathered in the street. A few people were filming what was happening on their phones. A young woman stepped forward holding a camera. "I can record, it's legal," she shouted, but Harris waved his hand. "Back off, or you're going with him," he cut her off, and she backed away. Caleb stared out the window as the car touched down. His mind was spinning with thoughts of how to prove his innocence. He knew the cameras could accidentally turn off and the evidence could be lost. But he kept quiet. Up ahead, Harris began whistling a tune as if nothing had happened. "Got a family, son?" he asked over his shoulder without turning around. Caleb didn't answer, clenching his fists in his lap. "You know what's funny?" the sergeant continued, not waiting for a reaction. "You all keep saying the same thing. Not mine. I was just walking." Brandon hummed from the passenger seat. "Should we place bets on which excuse we'll hear next?" he suggested, and they both laughed. Caleb stared out the darkness outside the window, feeling the anger growing inside. They thought they had won. They had no idea who he was or what awaited them. The morning at the Nashville County Courthouse was noisy and bustling. The room was filled with people, reporters with notebooks, law students, and gawkers who had come to watch another quick trial. Caleb Wilson sat at the defense table with his hands folded in front of him, outwardly calm, though inside he was seething. His dark suit, slightly wrinkled from a night in the cell, contrasted with the white shirt he'd been brought in before the hearing. Across from him, at the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney David Lawson pored over papers, radiating confidence. The officers who'd arrested Caleb SGT, Paul Harris, Brandon Cox, and a third, silent Ethan Reed, sat off to the side, cracking quiet jokes. Caleb's public defender, a guy named Nathan Perry, looked like he hadn't slept in days. He was in his early 30s, his hair disheveled, and his tie was askew. He leaned over to Caleb, whispering, "Look, I've seen this kind of case dozens of times. It's a long shot." Nathan spoke quickly, nervously rubbing his pen. "Judge Claire Thompson doesn't like to procrastinate. Better take the deal." Caleb turned his head, looking intently at the lawyer. "What kind of deal is being offered?" he asked, voice steady, without a hint of panic. Nathan sighed, lowering his eyes into the folder. 6 years, maybe 4, if you keep quiet and don't make a move, he answered, clearly not believing in any other outcome. Caleb repeated to himself, 6 years for something he didn't do. He shifted his gaze to the officers. Harris caught his eyes and nodded slightly, as if to say, "Hold still, kid." Caleb took a deep breath, suppressing the urge to say anything right now. "Let's go to the trial," he said to Nathan, leaving no room for argument. Nathan froze, then nodded, though it was obvious he would have preferred to give up. Judge Thompson entered the courtroom, a woman in her 60s with short gray hair and a stern face. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and muttered, "Let's not take too long, I'm on a tight schedule." David Lawson stood up, buttoned his jacket, and began to speak. "Your Honor, we have overwhelming evidence against the defendant." His voice sounded smooth, rehearsed, like a man accustomed to winning. Caleb listened half-heartedly. He knew this scenario. Lawson called the first witness, Officer Ethan Reed. He stood up, adjusted his uniform, and placed his hand on his Bible, swearing an oath to tell the truth. Lawson stepped closer, smiling as if they were old friends. "Officer Reed, tell us how you met the defendant on the evening of September 17th, he asked, crossing his arms. Reed spoke calmly, unemotional. "We were patrolling an area near Park Street known for drugs and petty crime." He paused, looking at the jury. "Saw a man acting strangely, quickened his step when he noticed us." Caleb sat still, though inside everything clenched with indignation. He remembered that night. He just walked to his car, not quickening his step, not looking back. "We stopped him for a checkup. He started asking questions, like he was hiding something," Reed continued, looking toward Lawson. "When we searched him, we found a baggie of white powder in his jacket." Lawson nodded, turning to the jury. "For the record, the substance turned out to be cocaine. Tests confirmed," he added, and there was a whisper in the room. Caleb noticed one of the jurors, an older woman, shake her head. Nathan didn't even try to object. He just sat staring at the table. Brandon Cox was called next. He repeated almost exactly the same thing, adding, "He looked like he knew we'd find evidence." Caleb gritted his teeth. The lie sounded practiced, like a memorized text. Then it was Sergeant Harris's turn. He stood up with a slight smile, as if this was all routine. "We went strictly by the book, no violations," he said, looking directly at the judge. "Searched him, found drugs, everything as it should be." His voice was firm, confident, and the jury listened intently. Nathan finally stood up, reluctantly beginning his cross-examination. "Sergeant, you say he was acting suspiciously, but was he running away?" he asked, leafing through the papers. Harris shook his head. "No, he wasn't running away, but he looked nervous," he replied, squinting slightly. "Did he resist you physically?" Nathan continued, clearly not knowing where to take the conversation. "No, but he asked questions as if he wanted to confuse us," Harris said, and someone in the room chuckled. Nathan hesitated, then mumbled, "Where exactly was the bag found? Please tell me again." Harris answered without hesitation, "In the left pocket of my jacket, that's clear." Nathan nodded and sat down without asking any more questions. Caleb looked at him, realizing that the lawyer wasn't even trying to fight. The jurors looked at each other, some taking notes. The officers relaxed, Lawson looked pleased, and Judge Thompson was getting ready to close. Caleb waited. They thought they had everything under control, but he knew that was about to change. The courtroom in Nashville hummed with tension as the trial moved toward its finale. The jurors sat in silence, some making final notes in their notebooks, others simply staring at Caleb Wilson with weary indifference. Judge Claire Thompson was flipping through documents, clearly ready to render a verdict and move on to the next case. Prosecutor David Lawson finished his speech by confidently telling the jury, "You've heard the facts, you've seen the evidence, now the choice is yours." He spoke as if the outcome was a foregone conclusion and returned to his desk with a slight smile. The officers SGT. Paul Harris, Brandon Cox, and Ethan Reed sat a little farther away, exchanging glances full of confidence. Public Defender Nathan Perry rose to give the last word. He nervously adjusted his tie and approached the jury, trying to look convincing. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to consider what we know for certain," he began, stuttering on every other word. "My client claims to be innocent, and that's important to consider. His voice shook, and it was clear he didn't believe what he was saying. "We didn't see everything that happened there, so there must be doubt," he added, fell silent, and quickly sat back down. Judge Thompson sighed, clearly annoyed at such a weak defense. Caleb sat still, but there was a tension building inside him that he was carefully hiding. He looked at Harris, who was grinning slightly, as if celebrating a victory. It was the same look, cocky, confident, full of contempt for the dark-skinned man sitting on the bench. Caleb knew it was the kind of look he'd seen all his life, knew how the system worked against people like him. But today was going to be different. Judge Thompson looked up and said, "All right, jurors, you may proceed to deliberations." She already had the Havelis in her hand, preparing to strike. And then Caleb decided it was his time. He slowly leaned forward and said, "Your Honor, let me say something before I do." His voice was even but firm, and there was a power in it that no one had expected. The judge frowned, clearly unhappy with the intrusion. "Mr. Wilson, you had your chance through an attorney," she cut off, but Caleb continued without losing his cool. "I understand, but this is important. Give me a minute to introduce myself properly," he asked, looking her straight in the eye. Thompson hesitated, but waved her hand, letting him speak. There was silence in the room, and all eyes turned to Caleb. He stood up, slowly squared his shoulders, and turned to Sergeant Harris. "You and your men have thought this through perfectly," he began, his voice sounding almost respectful. "The evidence planted carefully, the witnesses cleared, even picked a lawyer to keep out of the way." Harris frowned, his smile disappearing, and Cox beside him tensed. Caleb nodded, as if appreciating their work. "It would have worked for anyone else without question," he added, pausing. Then he slipped his hand into the pocket of his jacket, the same one where the drugs had supposedly been found. Everyone froze, waiting to see what would happen next. Caleb pulled out a leather case, opened it in one motion, and there was a collective gasp. A gold badge gleamed under the light of the lamps, and it read FBI. Beneath the badge was his name and title, Caleb Wilson, Superintendent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Judge Thompson pitched forward, her eyes widening. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling for the first time that morning. Caleb didn't bother to repeat himself. He just held his badge up higher for all to see. "I'm Caleb Wilson, and I'm here for a reason," he said, shifting his gaze to the officers. Harris went pale, his hands clenched into fists. Cox opened his mouth, but couldn't find the words, and Reed stared at the floor as if he wanted to fall through. Caleb stepped to the prosecution table and looked at Lawson. "Mr. Lawson, care to explain how you miss cases with fake evidence?" he asked, maintaining an icy calm. The prosecutor froze, his face turning gray. Then Caleb took a small tape recorder out of his pocket and turned it on. Harris's voice came out, recorded in the car. "All you guys keep saying one thing. It's not mine. I had nothing to do with it." Cox's laughter sounded next, and chaos ensued in the room. The reporters jumped up, snapping pictures on their phones. The jurors whispered, and Nathan Perry stared at Caleb with his mouth open. Caleb turned off the tape and said, "I have hours of these conversations, and this is just the beginning." He looked at Harris, who was now breathing heavily, realizing the game was over. The courtroom in Nashville became a seething cauldron after Caleb Wilson's words. Journalists jumped from their seats, their phones capturing every moment, and voices merged into a hum that was impossible to make out. The jury, just a moment ago ready to pass sentence, now looked at Caleb with a mixture of amazement and shame. Judge Claire Thompson tapped her Havelis on the table, her face flushed with tension. "Silence! I demand order in this chamber." She shouted, but her voice was drowned in the noise. Caleb stood still, holding his FBI badge in one hand and a tape recorder in the other, as chaos grew around him. "Sergeant!" Paul Harris jumped up from his chair, his face contorted with anger and fear. "This is a setup. You can't just turn this around," he shouted, pointing a finger in Caleb's direction. His voice shook, giving away the panic he was trying to hide. Brandon Cox, sitting next to him, gulped and muttered, "Sarge, maybe we shouldn't. Let's deal with this." But Harris wasn't listening. He stepped forward like he was about to do something. Ethan Reed stayed where he was, his head down, his hands nervously rubbing the edge of his uniform. Caleb looked at them without a shadow of a doubt, his voice remaining steady. "The setup is what you set up for me the other night," he said, looking directly at Harris. "I just let you play your game to the end." He turned to Judge Thompson, who was still trying to regain control. "Your Honor, I have evidence against more than just these 3 men," he continued, taking a step toward the center of the room. This is a whole network, and I'm here to expose it. At that moment, the doors to the hall opened, and three men in dark suits entered the room. They moved quickly and confidently, their FBI badges gleaming in the light. One of them, a tall man with short black hair, approached Harris. "Paul Harris, you're under arrest for tampering with evidence and perjury," he said, pulling out handcuffs. Harris recoiled, but the agent grabbed his arm and snapped the metal around his wrists. "You don't realize who you're messing with. This is a mistake," yelled Harris as he was led away. Brandon Cox tried to back up against the wall, but the second agent intercepted him. "Brandon Cox, you're under arrest too. Don't move," he said, his voice cold and businesslike. Cox opened his mouth to object, but only squeezed out, "I didn't mean to. None of this was my idea." The agent shook his head and led him toward the exit. Ethan Reed didn't resist. He silently held out his hands as the third agent approached him. "I knew this would end badly," he muttered as he was led away. Prosecutor David Lawson stood at his desk, his hands shaking as he tried to gather papers. Caleb stepped closer and said, "Mr. Lawson, you could have stopped this earlier." Lawson looked up, his face pale. "I didn't know they were planting evidence, I swear to you," he replied, but his voice sounded unconvinced. Caleb shook his head. "You knew enough to ask questions, but you chose to turn a blind eye," he said, leaving the prosecutor unanswered. Judge Thompson finally rose from her seat, her gaze darting between Caleb and the officers being led away. "Mr. Wilson, are you arguing that this investigation is broader than this case?" she asked, trying to regain her credibility. Caleb nodded, turning toward her. "Yes, Your Honor, we have records, camera footage, witness statements," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "We will review dozens of cases from this court, including your rulings." Thompson froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She realized that her name might be under attack, too. The reporters were already filming her reaction, their cameras capturing every detail. Nathan Perry, Caleb's lawyer, sat silent, his face a mixture of shock and relief. Caleb looked at him and said, "Nathan, you might want to think about changing jobs." Nathan nodded, unable to find the words to answer. The officers were led away, their footsteps resounding in the corridor outside the door. The hall was still humming, but now it was a different noise, a mixture of surprise, anger, and realization. Caleb picked up his badge and put it back in his pocket. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there was more work to be done. But today he had shown that the system didn't always win. The people in the room looked at him in a new way, not as a defendant, but as a man who had turned the game around. The Nashville courtroom slowly quieted as the FBI agents led the officers away. The footsteps of Paul Harris, Brandon Cox, and Ethan Reed echoed in the hallway, mingling with the clamor of reporters who rushed after them with cameras and microphones. Caleb Wilson stood in the center of the hall, watching the facade of the system he'd spent years studying and making crumble. His dark eyes followed every movement, but his face remained impenetrable. He realized that this moment was not just his victory, but a signal to all those similarly trapped. Judge Claire Thompson sat at her desk, her hands still clutching the Havelis, though she no longer tried to knock. Her gaze fell on Caleb, and in it she read a mixture of confusion and anxiety. "Mr. Wilson, do you realize you've just stirred up an entire hive?" she asked, her voice sounding quieter than usual. Caleb nodded, slowly approaching her desk. "I know, Your Honor, and it was needed a long time ago," he replied, keeping his composure. "Too many people have been hurt by cases like mine." David Lawson, the prosecutor, was still standing at his seat, his papers lying in disarray. He tried to speak. "I had nothing to do with their machinations. You have to believe me." His voice shook, and it was clear he was trying to save his reputation. Caleb looked at him with cold disappointment. "You might have noticed something was wrong, but you were more comfortable not looking," he said, turning away from Lawson. The prosecutor slumped in his chair, realizing that his career hung in the balance. The reporters in the room were already making headlines, their voices filling the air with scraps of phrases: FBI versus local cops, Nashville scandal. One of them, a young guy with disheveled bangs, called out to Caleb, "Mr. Wilson, is it true you've been planning this all along?" Caleb turned to him and said, "I didn't plan the arrest, but I was prepared for it." His words sounded simple, but there was a strength in them that made the guy nod and write down the answer. The jurors began to disperse, their faces awkward. One woman in her 50s, with short brown hair, stopped and looked at Caleb. "We almost sent you to jail without even thinking about it," she said quietly, her voice shaking with shame. Caleb smiled at her for the first time that morning. "You didn't know who I was, and the system is designed for that," he replied, trying to reassure her. She nodded and walked away, but her words hung in the air. Nathan Perry, Caleb's attorney, finally rose from his chair. He walked over to Caleb, holding a folder of documents, and said, "I had no idea you were FBI, or I would have tried harder." Caleb looked at him with a slight chuckle. "You need to find a place where you can actually help people," he advised, clapping Nathan on the shoulder. Nathan nodded. His face was still in shock, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. Caleb picked up his briefcase and headed for the exit. The FBI agents, finished with their arrests, approached him. One of them, the tall man, said, "Sir, we're starting a background check on Thompson and Lawson. It's going to take a while." Caleb nodded and replied, "Do it thoroughly. We need to get everyone out who's hurt." The agent nodded back, and they separated, leaving Caleb alone at the door. He walked outside, where the sun had already risen high above Nashville. A crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, people filming him on their phones, some shouting questions, some just watching. Caleb stopped and looked around at them. He knew this story would spread all over the state and maybe even farther. But for him, it wasn't about the fame. He thought about those who couldn't prove their truth, those who were broken by the system because of skin color or poverty. Caleb took a deep breath and walked to his car. He realized that there was still a lot of work to do, dozens of cases to review, hundreds of people to pull out of the shadow of injustice. Today had shown that change was possible if someone was willing to stand up and fight. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove away from the courthouse. This was not the end, but only the beginning of a path he had chosen long ago. The courtroom in Nashville had emptied, but the echoes of events still hung in the air. Caleb Wilson walked out of the building, leaving behind the buzz of reporters and the stares of the crowd gathered on the steps. The sun was high, lighting up the streets of the city, which was now buzzing with news of the scandal. Caleb got into his rental car, threw his briefcase on the passenger seat, and closed his eyes for a moment. He felt tired, but not the kind of fatigue that breaks the body, but the kind that comes after a long struggle when victory is near. His phone vibrated. It was one of the FBI agents who'd been helping with the arrests. "Sir, we've started digging deeper as you requested," the voice on the other end of the line said. Caleb put the line on speaker and replied, "Good, keep me posted, especially on the Thompson cases." The agent was quiet for a moment, then added, "There are names popping up already, dozens of cases over the last 5 years." Caleb nodded to himself, looking out the windshield at the passers-by. He knew the corruption in this court was no accident, but a system honed over the years. "Check everything, even the small details. It's important," he said, and the agent agreed, ending the call. Caleb started the engine and drove toward his temporary office downtown. The radio was already discussing his case. The announcer was talking about the FBI man who turned the game around. Caleb turned off the sound. He didn't need the praise. He thought about those he hadn't had time to save, people like him, African Americans who were crushed by the system without evidence. His work with the FBI had started because of that. He'd seen his cousin jailed for a theft he hadn't committed, just because of the color of his skin and his poor neighborhood. Half an hour later, he was sitting at a desk in a small office, reviewing the first reports from the team. Names flashed across the laptop screen. 23 people convicted in the last 2 years in cases involving Harris and Cox. Caleb read each line, noting the familiar details, the planted evidence, the lack of camera footage, the pressure on witnesses. He remembered the woman on the jury who'd almost sent him to prison, and her words about how easily they believed lies. It wasn't her fault, but the system that made lying the norm. There was a knock on the door, and Agent Linda Morgan, a short woman with dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, entered. She placed a folder on the desk and said, "We found something else, footage from the Park Street camera that night." Caleb looked up, feeling his pulse quicken. "Show me," he said, and Linda turned on the video on her tablet. The screen showed Harris stashing something in his jacket pocket while Cox surveyed the street. This was evidence that could turn the tables. "With this, we'll shut down not only their business, but the entire network," Linda said, her voice shaking with excitement. Caleb nodded and added, "Send copies to headquarters. Have them prepare a review of the verdicts." Linda left, and Caleb leaned back in his chair, looking up at the ceiling. He realized that this day would change the lives of dozens of people, but he also knew something else. There were still years of work ahead. Racism and injustice wouldn't disappear overnight, but he could give people a chance they didn't have. Later that evening, Caleb stood at the window, looking out at the lights of Nashville. His phone vibrated again, a message from an old college friend. "You showed them all, bro. Proud of you." Caleb smiled, but didn't respond. He thought of his brother, of those who were still waiting for the truth. The next day, he was to meet with local activists to tell them what had happened and urge them not to be silent. This was not just his victory, but the beginning of something bigger. Caleb turned off the light in his office and went outside. He decided to walk to the hotel, feeling the cool wind on his face. The city had a life of its own, but somewhere out there were people who would find out tomorrow that their cases would be reviewed. He knew he wouldn't fix everything, but at least some of the shadows would dissipate. This was what he'd worked for all his life, not for a badge, but for those who couldn't get up on their own. Caleb walked forward, knowing that the fight was just beginning, but now he had a voice that everyone could hear. What do you think? How many people are still waiting for their truth because of such systems? Have you experienced injustice where the color of your skin decided everything? What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you stay silent or fight? Write your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you think. If this story touched you, share it. Silence only helps the guilty.